I'm very passionate about the thing I'm going to speak to you about as well. And in the brief time that I have allotted, I'd like to sketch out how and why we are all connected, and how and why social networks affect all kinds of phenomena, and how we can use insights that have been gathered over the last 20 and in fact over the last 100 years about social networks and their formation and operation to accelerate behavioral change and to improve society. Now, there's been a revolution in social network analysis just in the last 15 years, and it's going to permit us to innovate in all kinds of new ways when it comes to social and behavioral change. And the kinds of networks that I'm interested in are the kind of networks that human beings have been making for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. They're sort of ancient kind of social networks, not so much the recent Facebook and Twitter and online social networks. Now, here's what a face-to-face social network looks like. Every dot is a person. Every line between them represents a relationship of some kind between the two people. And these networks, to my eye, are intricate things of beauty. And they are so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, that one has to wonder, what purpose do they serve? Why do we humans do this? Why do we make these incredibly beautiful, incredibly intricate things? And we, after having made them, we proceed to live out our lives embedded in a particular spot within this network. So the intellectual questions become, how do they form, how do they work, and how do they affect us? And I've spent the last 10 years or so, along with my colleague James Fowler, investigating how and why human beings form social networks and how they affect our lives, our health, our desires, our feelings, our thoughts, and our actions. Now, I'm going to start very briefly with the case of obesity, which kind of illustrates some of the points that we'd like to make. As most of you know, the prevalence of obesity in the developed world has increased from about 20 to 30% just in the last 10 years, and the prevalence of overweight is about 2/3 of Americans are overweight. And numerous explanations, most of which are likely to be true, have been advanced for this epidemic, but we wondered whether we could add an explanation. Could we understand obesity as a kind of social contagion? And it had become fashionable to speak about obesity as being an epidemic, and it's clear that obesity was epidemic in one meaning of the word, which is that there was more of it than there used to be before. But we wondered whether we could understand obesity as being epidemic in the other meaning of the word. Was it literally epidemic, not just metaphorically epidemic? Was something spreading from person to person? And to the extent that obesity is a product of voluntary choices and actions, and to the extent that people are affected by the choices and actions of people around them, it didn't strike us as incredible or implausible that we might be able to ascertain such an effect. So this is a study. This is one image from this body of work that we did. Again, a network here drawn from the Framingham Heart Study, which we reconfigured in ways I won't go into today to ascertain the network ties. Every dot is a person. Every line between them represents a relationship of different kinds: brothers, sisters, spouses, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and so forth. We make the dot size proportional to people's body mass index, so bigger dots are bigger people. And we also color the dots yellow if people are properly obese. And if you look at this image, you might be able to see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese individuals within the network, as if there were local outbreaks within this sort of fabric of humanity. In one particular region, people came to share this property of having a similar body size. But the complexity is still very high, visually speaking, and in any case, several questions are raised by this clustering of, for example, how much clustering is there? Is there more clustering than simply due to chance? How big are the clusters? And most interestingly, what might cause the clusters? So we borrowed some techniques from statistical physics, which I won't go into right now, and we did some tests which demonstrate the following. On the x-axis is the degrees of separation between the two people, and on the y-axis is the increase in the probability that a person is obese given that a social contact of theirs is obese. And on the far left, it shows that if your friends are obese, you've got a 45% higher likelihood of being obese yourself at 1 degree of separation. And then in the red bar, it says if your friends' friends are obese, you've got a 25% higher likelihood of being obese. And then in the orange bar, it's at 3 degrees of separation. It says if your friends' friends are obese, you've got a 10% higher likelihood of being obese. And it's only when we get to your friends' at 4 degrees of separation that there's no longer a relationship between that person's body size and your body size. So if I knew nothing else about you, then the body size of this person who is a stranger to you, your friend's friends or your friend's friends, it would increase my ability to say something about your body size. This seemingly very personal, individualistic phenomena seems to cluster and correlate within networks in ways that raise very interesting questions. So this analysis, first of all, confirms that the clusters are more than expected due to chance, and second, that the radius of the clusters is to 3 degrees of separation. But it doesn't tell us what might cause the clusters. And there are at least three possible explanations, all of which are typically present in any social phenomenon. And the challenge comes to disarticulate these using observational or experimental methods. One possibility is a kind of social domino effect, whereby my weight gain causes Gary's weight gain then spreads to William's weight gain, and you got a spread in the network. Another possibility is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together, or love of like. Here it's not that my weight gain causes Gary's weight gain. Here it's that Gary and I form a connection to each other because we have similar body size or similar behaviors to begin with. And last is the possibility of confounding. Here the idea is that Gary and I jointly share an exposure to something like a gym, which loses our weight, or something like a marketing campaign, which increases our weight simultaneously. Now, it takes a lot of effort using a variety of econometric techniques to disarticulate these. All of them are present, and we were able, using a variety of approaches, to develop evidence for the presence of induction, or a kind of person-to-person contagion in obesity in this situation, across the host of types of relationships: friends, siblings, spouses, and coworkers. And I should emphasize that both weight gain and weight loss could spread in the system. And in fact, if your friends or your friends' friends gain or lose weight, it ripples through the network and affects you, a kind of social contagion very similar to a biological contagion. And there are a variety of mechanisms that this might work, including a spread of behaviors. When your friends say, let's go have, Gary says, let's go have muffins and beer. It's a terrible combination, but he's my friend and he recommended it, so I adopt this thing. Or my friends say, let's switch to safflower oil instead of mustard seed oil, and I adopt the practice as a result of that. Or it could be a spread of norms. So what spreads is not a behavior, but rather an idea. So Gary gains weight and it changes my idea about what an acceptable body size is, and then I pass that along to the next person. Well, we eventually started looking at other phenomena, such as human emotions. And when human beings have emotions, we show them. Why? Why do we show our emotions? I mean, it's not hard to construct an argument from evolutionary biology as to why we would experience emotions, why it would enhance our fitness as a species to feel anger or happiness or fear or disgust. But not only do we feel those feelings, we show them. And not only do I show them, but you can read it. And not only do you read it, but you copy it. You copy my emotions. Emotional contagion, you see, would be seem to be something very deeply fundamental in our humanity. Now, this function of emotions suggests that whatever other advantages they offer, they're also a primitive form of communication. And we're accustomed to thinking about emotional contagion as fleeting and involving just a pair of people. And I gave a talk like this 3 or 4 years ago in New York City, and I said, you know, when you're on the subway and you look at the person across from you, and they smile at you, and you just instinctively smile back? And they said, we don't do that in New York City. And I said, everywhere else in the world, that's normal human behavior. So we're accustomed to thinking about emotions as fleeting and involving just pairs of people. But of course, it can be broader still, as in the form of punctuated collective expressions of anger, as in the form of riots. But we wondered whether we could understand emotions as happening in a more sustained way than riots. Could there be a kind of a quiet riot? Could there be a kind of emotional stampede rippling below the surface of human social networks, such that your emotional state came to depend on the emotional state not only of the people to whom you were directly connected, but even to the emotional state of strangers to you, your friends' friends, and your friends' friends' friends? Maybe emotions have a collective existence, not just an individual existence. So we made what I think is the first network map of human emotions. Every dot is a person, the lines are relationships, the blue dots are sad people, the yellow dots are happy people, and the green dots are in between. And if you look at this image, you can see again evidence of clustering of emotion within the networks, of sad clusters and happy clusters within the system. Also, and they spread in, again, to 3 degrees of separation. And also, some of the things that are interesting is that the unhappy people seem to be more likely to be located at the periphery of the network. Now, this work with emotions, which are so fundamental, and our desire to begin to do some experimental work, moving away from observational work, led us to study altruism in an experimental setting. Could we develop evidence that pay it forward is real? That if I'm kind to you, you'll be kind to someone else, and this kindness will ripple through the system. I won't go into the details of the experiment, which we published a year ago in PNAS, but the gist of it is we took strangers to each other, we randomly assigned them to interact, they played a public goods game, an economic game with each other, and we found that if one person is kind to another person, that person not only will reciprocate the kindness, but will pass it on. We found specifically that if Eleni in this experiment was kind to Lucas in period 1, Lucas would go on to be kind to Erica in period 2, in red, the red outline. Erica would go on to be kind to Jay in period 3, and Jay would be kind to Brecken in period 4. And what's amazing about this is that Jay's kindness to Brecken depends on Eleni's kindness to Lucas, and neither Jay nor Brecken ever interacted with Eleni or Lucas. So this is not a homophily that's causing this. It's not confounding. This is experimental evidence of a kind of induction, a kind of spreading process within the network. So things spread in networks, and we of others have shown this for a variety of non-obvious phenomena: obesity, smoking, drinking, and drug use, happiness, loneliness, depression, and altruism, sleep, vaccination behavior, purchasing, and ideas. And this 3 degrees of influence thing is just a rule of thumb. It's not, it varies. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, and not everything spreads. I've become a zealot about networks, but I'm not that insane as to think everything spreads. And not everything that spreads by the same mechanism. And this is a very important idea. When we use the word spread, we don't mean that things have to spread the same way. So germs spread differently than ideas, which spread differently than emotions, which spread differently than money. They don't all spread in exactly the same way. But a key idea is that networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. Networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. It's one of the deep functions of networks. Alas, they will magnify both bad and good things. But if we seed them properly, we can take advantage of networks' intrinsic propensity to magnify things and achieve what we want. Now, there's another way that we are affected by networks, which I need to emphasize before moving on, and that is that we're not just affected by what's happening in the networks around us. The actual structure of the network matters as well. So think about these 2 objects. They're commonplace objects, and you both know them, and you all know both of them, and you probably remember from high school chemistry that they're both made of carbon. And the difference between the 2 is that if you assemble the carbon atoms one way, on the left, you get graphite, which is soft and dark. And if you assemble the carbon atoms another way, on the right, you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are 2 key intellectual properties about this analogy. First, these properties, this softness and darkness and hardness and clearness, do not inhere in the carbon atoms. They're not properties of the carbon atoms. They're properties of the collection of carbon atoms, first. Second, which properties you get, softness or darkness or hardness and clearness, depends on how you assemble the carbon atoms to each other. And similarly, you can take the same human beings and assemble them one way and you get one set of properties, or wire them another way and you get a completely different set of properties in ways I don't have time to go into today. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties emerge in social systems because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily the people themselves. So it's not just what's happening in those around us, whether they're using an emollient or losing weight, that is relevant. It's also the actual architecture of the ties around us that's important. Our experience of the world depends on the actual structure of the ties around us, near and far. Now, one of my favorite examples of this, which I won't belabor, has to do with some work done by a colleague of mine at the Kellogg School, Brian Utsi, who looked at the success of Broadway musicals according to the architecture of the Broadway musical production company. And what he found is that if you look at the structural features of the network, and the cartoons on the left illustrate 3 possible structures of who knows who in the production company, the producer, the director, the librettist, and so forth, he looked at, on the far right, the success of the musical, and on the y-axis is the success rate of the musical, how much money it makes, how critically acclaimed is it, and on the x-axis, one measure of the network, the density of the ties, and he found on the far left, if there's 0% density, if nobody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And on the far right, he found that if everybody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And in the middle, where some people knew each other from before and some did not, the show was a big success. So this illustrates the idea that it's not just what's happening to those around you, it's how the network is wired can also affect the properties that groups evince. So findings such as these and much other work that we in our group have done and other groups have done have led us and others to ask if we can intervene in social systems in ways that exploit an understanding of social networks that enhances public health and public policy. And we think about network-informed policies, strategies, and interventions in 2 ways. One, you can manipulate the connections between people and change the structure of the ties. For instance, Weight Watchers or Alcoholics Anonymous is an artificial social network where you force people together in a particular way. Or you can intervene in contagion, accept the network as it is, and try to manipulate the flow of information through the network by like opening and closing valves as if in a pumping system where water is flowing through a network of pumping systems. Now there's expanding science in both areas, and I'm only going to briefly sketch the latter. We're in the midst of doing some experiments ourselves, and we're planning hopefully to do some more with the Gates Foundation in India. Just to quickly sketch what you might do, imagine that you have two villages, and the network of one village is shown on the left, and the network of another village, otherwise randomly chosen and similar, is shown on the right. And on the right, you intervene in the yellow dots, the 6 yellow dots, and you give them some information. Then you come back a year later and you compare the untreated people in the left to the untreated people in the right. Untreated to untreated. And you test, is there more knowledge in the untreated people on the right than there is in the untreated people on the left? And this would be evidence of a network spillover effect. Not only did the treated people adopt what you told them, which is interesting and important, but also it spread to other people. And now you would experimentally show this by a controlled experiment. Or you could begin to get really creative and smart. Instead of picking people at random on the right, you can only afford to reach 6 people. Which are the smartest 6 people you can reach to have the biggest impact at scale from the intervention you're giving, given the budget constraint? Well, maybe instead of picking the people randomly, or even instead of picking them based on attributes of themselves, like their education or their race or their caste, instead pick them according to their network position. Maybe pick 6 central people. Now, if you do this experiment, you can see, is the spillover effect bigger in this experiment than in the previous experiment? If so, this documents the fact that targeting specific individuals creates bigger spillover effects. It would prove the fact that actually your network position affects the extent to which you can magnify what the network is seeded with. And there are other kinds of ideas as well you can use for targeting. You can target clusters of the people. So here, there are 2 experiments embedded in this idea. On the left, you target 6 randomly chosen people. On the right, you target 6 people in a cluster in the lower left, as you can see. Now you can test 2 things. First, you can see if I target the treated individuals in the left, the 6 random people, and I come back in a year, maybe one of the 6 would have adopted the intervention. So among the treated, 1 out of 6 adopts in the left-hand village. In the right-hand village, where I take the same resources and I target 6 people in a natural cluster, maybe they reinforce the behavior. Maybe 5 of the 6 will adopt. Same number of people, same resources expended, but now we use the power of social networks to magnify what they are seeded with. We reinforce the behavior, we have much bigger impact. That's among the treated. But there could also be bigger effects among the untreated in using the strategy on the right. And you can test that by comparing the untreated in the right to the untreated in the left and see if you get a little kind of sort of echo chamber going where you have a seed of people that are actively doing it, do they create bigger ripples in the network on the right than in the left? We're beginning to test these ideas and map networks in a variety of developing world settings in my laboratory, in Tanzania, in Uganda, and Honduras. The Honduras work is work done in collaboration with Derek Stafford and Alex Hughes. All the other work is done with James Fowler at UCSD. And we have beginning to think about doing some work in India. I'm going to just show you some pilot results from Uganda and Tanzania. In our Uganda project, when we got to the field in Uganda, we were stunned to find that there was already a lot of local knowledge, speaking about local knowledge like Melinda was earlier, about networks. On the left is a little pamphlet that is indigenously made about why when you have sex with someone else, you're having sex with all the other people they've had sex with. But it's rendered as a network. And on the right is a big billboard, which talks again about the social network. And this is indigenously created material within Uganda. So the people there, including in the villages, already were used to thinking in network terms. So we were grafting our approach onto a set of indigenous ideas about human interaction. And once the pilot is complete, we're going to be able to test to see whether targeting of the kind that I've been describing to you for bed nets, for reduction, can we get people to adopt bed nets to reduce mosquito-borne illnesses in this society? Can we get other kinds of neonatal practices? We're going to be looking at India. We also just recently completed a project with the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. This was a very difficult project to do. It was spearheaded by a postdoc in my lab by the name of Corin Apicella, driving in a Land Rover over 4,000 square kilometers. And we did a photographic census of the Hadza. They are hunter-gatherers. They have no possessions to speak of. They sleep under the stars. There are only about 1,000 of them left, only about 500 adults. We mapped this network because we were interested in understanding, do these ancient networks look like modern networks? Remember earlier I said we've been making these networks for tens of thousands of years. We wanted to prove that we've been making networks like this for tens of thousands of years. So we did this photographic census, we took it to the field, we had the Hadza identify who their friends were, and when we mapped the network, in fact, they looked just like modern human networks. And we also got these people to play a public goods cooperation game. We got the Hadza to do this, and we found very interestingly that there were clusters of cooperators and non-cooperators among the Hadza population. The cooperative Hadza stuck together, and they excluded the non-cooperative Hadza who were stuck on their own. So I'm going to close now with a broader intellectual argument about why I think social networks are important. From an evolutionary and a modern perspective, the question is, what's the point of a connected life? How does it help us as an individual and as a species? And it turns out that networks are a resource that we can all use. They're a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. And two further key and subtle ideas about capital are, number one, that to create capital, you have to invest skill and effort. You have to know something and do something to make capital. And number two, and this is even more subtle, in order to make capital, you have to introduce changes into a substance that make it more productive than it otherwise would have been. So in other words, you have to manipulate the world and reshape it in a way that makes it more productive. And it's that thing that acts as a reservoir of wealth. For example, a farm is a stock of capital. You invest skill and effort, you clear the woods, and you create a thing that is more valuable, at least vis-a-vis production of fruits and vegetables and grains, than it was before. And so the farm is a reservoir of wealth because you've invested skill and effort, and you've worked upon the land and transmuted it. Or think about this. You can take a tree and invest skill and effort and mill it and make it into lumber. And when you do that, the lumber is more valuable than the tree. It's a reservoir of wealth. You've transmuted the tree. And what can you do with that? Well, you can take the wood and make a violin by investing still more skill and effort, which is even more valuable because you can do things with a violin you couldn't do with a tree, with a lumber, namely make music. So capital is a change that allows a substance to act in new ways. And this is part of what makes it a store of wealth and a source of productive power. Now, in the 1960s, there was a big movement among the social scientists to begin to think about human capital. So here the idea is that human beings can be a reservoir of wealth. So you can take this dissolute graduate student of mine on the far left, and you can make a lot of skill and effort and clean him up so he's no longer an alcoholic. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and you make him into the guy in the middle. And then you can invest still more skill and effort and give him an education. And what you've done is you've changed his mind. You've worked upon the material world, you have rewired the neurons in his brain, and now he becomes more valuable. He's a reservoir of wealth. He is a stock of human capital. Well, just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital by a change in persons, social capital in organizations, in companies, in communities, or in our whole society is a change in the relations among persons, a change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things it previously was not able to do. There is value in these connections. There is value in whether we cooperate with each other. There is value in the natural flow of information. It's all around us. One of the reasons we human beings make social networks, and have done so since we evolved to do so, is precisely to make this kind of social capital. So this is my last slide. This perspective on humans and social systems has a number of implications. First, as we have seen, we gain insight into how the whole comes to be greater than the sum of its parts. It's the ties that add value and that provide the basis for social capital. So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Second, it also means that there can be new kinds of hierarchy in social systems that we've not previously paid much attention to. For instance, we were accustomed to thinking about the rich and the poor and the black and the white and the high and the low caste and so forth, but maybe we should really be asking additional questions. Which networks are people members of? Who are they connected to? What subclusters within the system are they? Where are they structurally within the network? And what does it mean for their life experience? And what does it mean for us who might wish to change the world in which they live in terms of targeting them? Third, we must realize that networks permit social externalities. If you replace my hip, not only does my quality of life goes up, but my wife's quality of life goes up. So if you look at your return on investment as just what you do to me, you're missing a big part of the story. Or if you get me to quit smoking and you spend $10 to get me to quit and lose sight of the fact that my having quit results in 10 other people around me quitting, you have a tenfold order of magnitude bigger return on your investment than you ever realized. So mapping networks and beginning to see to what extent do these externalities exist can give us additional justification for an understanding of how we scale things. How is it the case that a particular intervention has an effect? And finally, or not finally, penultimately, we can use this insight that social networks magnify your effect, and second, that they disseminate knowledge both among the target population and among professionals. So if we do an intervention that shows that it's work, we can begin to understand how ideas diffuse within society, not just within the target population, but amongst practitioners. Social network interventions are also increasingly becoming possible in the developing world in ways I don't have time to go into, by exploiting massive passive data like cell phones that are widely available in the developing world as well. So this social network perspective highlights the fact that we form social networks because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. If I was always violent towards you, or gave you bad germs, or gave you misinformation, or made you miserably unhappy, you would cut the ties to me and the network would disintegrate. Therefore, the flow of good and desirable things, like ideas, like kindness, like love, like altruism, is required to sustain and nourish the network and keep it present. And similarly, the network is required for all these things we as people revere. We're not so interested in love of yourself, we're interested in love of others. We're not so interested in justice towards yourself, we're interested in justice towards others. The others are required for these pro-social goods to exist. Thus, the spread of good things is required for networks to endure. And if we realized how valuable networks are and what they are doing for us and what they can do, we'd be the better for it. Because I think social networks are required for goodness to flourish. Thank you.